Cultural competency training, systemic racism. As an educator in Minnesota, it is important to recognize the role that systemic racism plays in our education system and how it affects our students. To help you understand this issue more thoroughly, here are some ideas helps identify systemic racism. 1. Define systemic racism. Before diving deeper into the topic, it is important to define what systemic racism is. Systemic racism refers to the way that racism has been built into our societal structures, policies, and practices. It goes beyond individual acts of discrimination and is deeply embedded in our systems. 2. Understand the history of racism in Minnesota. In order to understand how systemic racism exists today, it is important to understand how it has been perpetuated historically in Minnesota. From redlining and discriminatory housing policies to unequal access to education, healthcare, and job opportunities, there are many examples of how systemic racism has affected the lives of people of color in Minnesota. 3. Recognize how systemic racism shows up in education. In our schools, systemic racism can show up in a variety of ways, including in unequal access to resources and opportunities, harsher disciplinary practices for students of color, and curriculum that ignores or erases the experiences and contributions of people of color. It is important to recognize these patterns and work to address them in our classrooms. 4. Prioritize equity and inclusion in your teaching. In order to counter systemic racism in your classroom, it is essential to prioritize equity and inclusion in your teaching practices. This means actively working to ensure that all students have equal access to resources and opportunities, examining and correcting any biases or stereotypes you may have, and intentionally including diverse perspectives and voices in your curriculum. 5. Work collaboratively with colleagues. Addressing systemic racism in education requires a collective effort. It is important to work collaboratively with your colleagues to identify and address these issues in your school and district. This can involve advocating for changes to policies and practices, sharing resources and strategies, and engaging in ongoing conversations and learning opportunities. By following these steps, you can work to understand and combat systemic racism in your classroom and school. As an educator, it is our responsibility to create a learning environment that is equitable, inclusive, and anti-racist, and by doing so, we can make a positive impact on the lives of our students.